we're going to begin having a conversation in front of you, and a very interesting title, How Did We Get in This Fix? Reflecting on the Past. Most of you know Dr. Doug Foster, longtime professor of church history at ACU. Doug recently retired and was succeeded by Dr. Wes Crawford, who came out of 20 years of local ministry, has earned doctorate in the same area that Dr. Foster does, actually from Vanderbilt University, the same university. We don't say that he is the replacement for Dr. Foster. Nobody replaces Dr. Foster. He succeeds him. So just thought I'd let... Dr. Suzie Macaluso is an expert in sociology of religion. She's also on our faculty. And Suzie, while I get up there, I've asked Suzie to give you some slides on the screen to get us started. And for the first time, we have really accurate and insightful research on what has happened, particularly within the Fellowship of Churches of Christ. So Suzie, without further ado, why don't you just get us into the material?
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Money. It is a pleasure to be here with you this afternoon. I'm just going to start with the bigger picture. Where do we fit into the larger trends in Christianity in the United States today, which is kind of my area of expertise. So let's start with this graph taken from the Pew Research Center, as well as some other data online. And this is just showing you from 2006 to 2016 the decline of white Christianity. I do want to note that most of the things that I'm going to be showing you do deal with white Christians in particular, and that's a little bit problematic, but that's what we've got to work with. So in 1972, Dean Kelly wrote the book, Why Conservative Churches Are Growing, and speculated that conservative churches were going to buck this trend of decline that we saw in mainline Christianity. And what we can see by this chart is that that has not held true. Right? So everyone is experiencing some decline. Some groups more than others. There are some groups within these broader evangelical, mainline, and Catholic denominations that are growing. But for the most part, Christianity in the United States is on the decline. Sociologists have been talking about that for the last 20 years or so. One of the things that we see in this decline is that we have a growth in the religiously unaffiliated. So this is data taken from the General Social Survey. This is a survey that's used to be done every year, now it's done every 2 years, of the general US population, everyone who speaks English in the United States. And so this is showing those people who claim no religious affiliation. And you can see how that has risen through the 1990s into the 2000s. And this fits with a larger trend that Robert Putnam describes in his book, Bowling Alone. In that book, he talks about Americans kind of leaving voluntary organizations, so thus bowling alone. People aren't joining bowling leagues anymore. There's kind of a peak for joining, which is the 1950s, which we'll also see as kind of the peak for growth in our tradition in Churches of Christ. And since then, we've seen this joining go down and decrease over time. And so that's true in our religious congregations as well. I also want to point out that these religiously unaffiliated are not necessarily agnostic or atheist. The percentage of people who identify specifically as agnostic or atheist is really not on the rise. Most of these groups would say that they are maybe spiritual but not religious, or they might identify as secular, or they might identify as just nothing, with no preference at all. And so this is a really interesting group. And this group is young. And so this shows you the age distribution and different religious groupings. So I want to draw your attention to the pink bars there, kind of at the top. Those are those unaffiliated. That's what that group is. And then you can see those age distributions at the bottom. And what you can see is that the youngest group there, the 18 to 25-year-olds, they have a large percentage that are unaffiliated. And then as we get older, we can see that number goes down. Older adults tend to be more religious than younger adults. And then if you look at the bottom in that darker blue color, that's the evangelical Christians. That's where sociologists place Churches of Christ. We can argue about that, but that's where sociologists tend to put us. And so that's where we would be included in this particular model. And so you can see kind of the inverse there, where for young adults, this is a very small portion, and for older adults, this is a much larger portion of that group. So where does this then leave us specifically? Where does this lead Churches of Christ? So I want to talk about some findings given to us by Dr. Stan Granberg. He wrote an article that came out last fall called A Case Study of Growth and Decline, The Churches of Christ 2006 to 2016. That was published in the Great Commission Research Journal. So this is looking at Church of Christ adherence. There's some disagreement in the literature about membership versus adherence and kind of our movement away from placing official membership in some congregations. And so I stuck with the adherence number because that was the most clear in the more recent data, the 1980 to 2016. We can go further back, but what you'll see is we're just climbing up until 1980. And then we continue to climb right up till 1990, and then something happens. We kind of top out. We have this kind of stabilization, and then we start to see a decline. This is something that happened all over the United States in lots of different denominations. It's part of that larger trend of the unaffiliated that we saw a few slides ago. Also take note that those 18 to 25-year-olds would have been growing up in the 1990s. So they would have been the most likely to have parents that were also unaffiliated. And so you have some generational influence there. If each generation loses a few, then by the time you have kind of this 4-generation gap, you've got quite a difference there. The next slide I want to show you kind of correlates with this and is what we would expect, has to do with Church of Christ congregations in the United States. And again, this is showing 1980 to 2016, looking at how many congregations we have in our fellowship. And you can see that just along with those membership numbers, you have this kind of rise up until the 1990s, as tapering off, and then a steady decline. And we'll come back to that in a few slides. Also, going along with this, I want to draw attention to this chart about congregations by size. So one of the kind of striking findings in Dr. Granberg's work is the size of average congregations of Churches of Christ in the United States. As you can see, more than half of congregations have less than 60 members. We are a collection of small bodies, small congregations, with no mega churches that Dr. Granberg noted. Any Churches of Christ that kind of have reached this size have changed their name and become non-denominational or changed to something else. In some of my other work that I've done on disaffiliation, some people note that they never left Churches of Christ, their church changed. And that's kind of an interesting side note here. But you'll notice how few churches we have that are in that kind of large 500 to 2,000 member groupings. So part of what Dr. Granberg points as the reason for some of this is a lack of church plantings. So I apologize for the quality of this chart. There was no way to kind of recreate it in a well way, so it's a screenshot. But this shows new church plantings from 1910 to 2016. And so you'll see in the 1950s there's this peak of church planting where we are very evangelistic, going out, planting new churches, within the United States. And we start to see that decline and taper off. And that tapering off, that decline, correlates with that decline in congregations and with that decline in church membership as well. We also, another way to look at this is to look at new churches by decade. So these are the numbers of churches that are started in the United States by decade. And so if you look at it rather than by individual year, you kind of group them together by decade. And again, that pattern exists. The peak is 1950 to 1959, and then we have this slow, steady decline. And so the fact that we were actually growing in numbers up until the 1980s is pretty remarkable, given that we weren't planting new churches at the same rate. So now I want to turn our attention from kind of this bigger picture to some data that I've collected with my colleague, Dr. Carly Dodd, and the help of the Siburt Institute. 17 congregations have taken the church health assessment. Actually, more than that have taken it. I am looking at 17 of those congregations. Some have taken it more recently and haven't been added into my data set. But we have about 2,600 respondents in this data set. And these trends track with a forthcoming research article from Tim Woodruff from Interim Ministry Partners that looks at 50 congregations that worked with his group. So it very much lines up with their experiences. So this one shows age cohorts. And so those two bottom cohorts, the under 18 and the 18 to 24, you could combine those to make these age cohorts more similar in terms of their size. But even when you do that, what you see is just the sheer number of members who are over the age of 55. So about 60% of members in these 17 congregations are over the age of 55. Now you can see where this is problematic, right? But this also matches up with that broader U.S. historical trend that I mentioned at the beginning. And it fits with that. But how are these churches going to grow with no youth? We'll also see that the length, that the years as a Christian, so this is something that Tim Woodruff put together, showing kind of this lack of new Christians coming into our membership, that we're kind of recycling. Even if people are coming to your church, they're probably coming from other groups. And so this shows us that most of the people in these churches have been Christians their entire lives. They're not new converts. Very few of them are new converts. And so I think that has something to tell us about where we're lacking or where we need to kind of focus our work. We also have the length of tenure. So in these congregations, again, this is from the church health assessments. It matches up with what Tim Woodruff has found as well. But in terms of the length of tenure, the majority of people in these congregations have been there for a long time, for 20 years or longer. I don't think that's a problem that people have been at their church for a long time. I think that says something for stability and for camaraderie and relationship in those churches. But what it means is you're not bringing in new members, and that's where it becomes problematic. Lastly, I want to talk about another article that Stan Granberg and Tim Woodruff wrote together that was kind of a projection into the future. So they wrote an article projecting what the year 2050 might look like for Churches of Christ. And this is actually one of their more conservative charts. They have a couple of different models that they look at. This one takes a look at the decline that we've seen in the last 10 years and projects it forward. They have some other models that aren't quite as linear, that kind of are a little more parabolic, and those show even more drastic decline. So they're projecting that we are going to basically lose half of our membership, half of our congregations by the year 2050. So it's not looking so great. So currently our decline is at about 5% every 3 years, and that's what they're projecting here into the future. These slides will be available on the Siburt Institute website, and they also include all of the references.
All right, thank you, Susie. That's a great summary. And I'm going to turn to Wes and Doug now. By the way, our job was to deliver the bad news. The rest of the seminar is what to do about it. So we want to make sure that you don't tag us with that line.
That's the only reason we agreed to be on this panel.
I know it. So where did it all start? I mean, what's your reaction to all this in terms of the historical perspective?
I'll say this, just from a pastoral point of view for a moment. On the one hand, this is alarming. You cannot see these statistics without being alarmed, being anxious about that to some extent at a macro level. At a micro level, I would also say, in some strange way, I hope this helps you a little bit because I know that there are many congregational leaders in this room, ministers, elders, people that are leading congregations that for some time have had the feeling oh my goodness, our congregation is shrinking. What are we doing wrong? We must have missed a step somewhere. And what I hope that you can see in the beginning of this conversation, the first one of this weekend, is that you are not alone. It's likely not something that you specifically at your congregation are doing wrong. These are trends that are happening across churches of Christ and really across American Christianity. We are seeing this almost without exception. And so I think it's important that we hear the message from the very beginning. Now, throughout the weekend, we're going to be talking about some descriptive things, and as we move on in the weekend, a little bit more prescriptive things, but I think it's important to understand that at the outset.
Well, the other thing that tells me is you have some powerful cultural forces at work somewhere. Doug, let's go back a little bit. Back into the early 19th century, the beginnings, what was the purpose of the people who saw the initial vision of a restoration of New Testament Christianity?
As far as our movement is concerned, there are a couple of major foci that you see early on, and there's a complex relationship between them, and it's not always understood the same. At least a couple of these foci. Restoration of the ancient gospel and order is the term that Alexander Campbell used. Now, restoration was not unique to us.
Right.
There were a number of other groups that used the same kind of terminology. The Baptists used restoration of New Testament Christianity. The Mormons would use the restoration of the gospel and so forth. So we're not unique in that, but we're unique in some ways in the way we understood the nature of restoration. Many of the people in the early days, I think, understood restoration as going back to something that had been lost or obscured, the heart of the gospel in a sense, what was really most important, and that they believed that if that were the case, if we did go back to those things that were absolutely core and central, what the heart of the gospel really was, it would bring about the unity of Christians. Now, there are different understandings of that as well. If we, in fact, understand restoration of the ancient gospel and order of things to be something that is not insisting on a lot of peripheral understandings, if you want to use the word opinion, I find that term a little problematic myself, but beliefs, and not insist on those to recognize others who are trying to follow Christ as your sister and brother and being able to work and worship together with them, then that would bring about the unity of the visible unity of Christianity. Now, we don't create unity. God created unity. There is one body. Somewhere along the line, a number of people began to say, okay, if you've restored the ancient gospel and order, and we have, and this is it, this is the package, and you don't see it, and we've worked really hard with you, and you still don't see it, then we can't have anything more to do with you. In fact, we can't even recognize you as a Christian. Now, we're not unique in that either.
Yeah.
There was a famous speech that was done years ago by a church historian named Samuel Hill, and he had a famous speech, a paper that he did on us. He said, the only ones were not the only ones. The ones who thought they were the only ones were not the only ones who thought they were the only ones. Okay? So that sectarian attitude was not unique to us, but it's a powerful temptation towards sectarian attitudes, divisive attitudes, if you are very serious about your beliefs, your convictions, and acting on those, and you believe at some point that that is a fairly large group of things.
Well, let me ask you, Wes, what was in the mind of, let's just say, Alexander Campbell and Barton Stone when they pulled their groups together, 1832?
Yes. I think this is a good question in terms of the identity. We're looking at what are some of the seeds that were planted that brought us to this point. Some of those seeds were planted within our own tradition. Some of those were planted within American Christianity more broadly, which we can talk about in a moment. But about our tradition, uniquely about our tradition. I'll go back to something that I actually saw in a class that Doug taught I was your student 1,000 years ago at Advanced Restoration History. And we were, to the point chronologically, we were talking about the moment where the Stone movement and the Campbell movements united. And this is an important part of our history in terms of our identity. Now, what stuck with me all these years later is not so much that they united, but the degree to which they disagreed. And they disagreed on just about everything. Every major theological category, as we define them, they disagreed upon. They disagreed on ideas of atonement. They disagreed on ecclesiology. They disagreed, really, in some sense, on Trinitarian thought. They disagreed on major issues, not on whether or not you should have a kitchen in the church building. They disagreed on major, fundamental theological principles. And still, they came together, they united. And that really, in the earliest days of the Stone-Campbell Movement, the Restoration Movement, that was our identity. That was what we were about. That's what we were known for, is that you have people within all of these different groups that claim to be Christian. They're wearing all these different denominational labels, have all these different beliefs, and they disagreed on so many things, but we agree on what's most important. So we can come together and we can call each other brother and sister. That's at the heart of our movement. And I think the degree to which we've lost sight of that, I think it's not surprising that we see the numbers decline the way they are, especially in a world like ours, which really is repelled by that idea.
More multiple options, Suzie. You were talking about that. How many options there are out there that are very similar, and you literally have. I'll be careful how I say this. You literally have some religious groups, oftentimes independent islands to themselves, who are probably doing a better job of the restoration of simple New Testament Christianity than those who made that original claim are doing. And we may quibble around the edges. So we were talking about the cultural forces that are at play. There's one that you might want to comment on, and Doug, if you would please. We have the Civil War coming up not too many years after what Wes is talking about there. And here's another big event in our national history that has even lasting implications for today, does it not?
Absolutely. You know, what we're talking about here, I'm kind of like what Wes said when he started his comments a few minutes ago. The data and the statistics actually can be quite disturbing, perplexing, but they also might cause us to react in a way that I think is really dangerous. It can actually be good. It can slap us in the side of the head, so to speak, and say, think about what's really going on here. Think about what's really important. But I think there's a tendency sometimes to say, okay, when we were growing in the 1980s, X and X was happening, and so that must not be happening anymore. So if we'll just go back to the 1980s and work harder and do some of that same stuff again, it'll turn around. And I don't believe that's true. And I'll tell you why. And I'll get to the Civil War in a second. We, Churches of Christ, like every other Christian group, have had the same temptations that all Christian groups have had. We're talking about Christian groups today. And we have bought into an American cultural standard of success. What makes a congregation successful? Big numbers. Influential people who are members. Big contributions. Paved parking lot that's really nice. When statistics are done about what people mark as a mark of a successful church, that actually shows up. Nice cars in the parking lot, etc. And that's not true. That is not what marks a successful church. There may be a successful church that incidentally has some of those marks, but that's not what is the sign of a successful church. We've bought in to American cultural values rather than Christian values. And I'm afraid that many of our congregations have bought into those American cultural national values more than scriptural values. And one of those values, and it's tied into the Civil War, it doesn't start with the Civil War, but it certainly is solidified and turned in a certain way in the time of the Civil War, is the ideology of white supremacy. We are like, again, we can quibble about specific details of doctrine and practice, but we are like a white evangelical group that looks like very much an American nationalistic group. Now, why do young people not like us? And why is there a larger growing, even of older people in that chart I was struck by, of older people who are now not affiliated with any religious group that had been? And that's true for churches of Christ as well. I understand this is complex. I understand it's complex and there's not one single thing. But the Civil War is sort of a microcosm for the ideology of white supremacy. And you can't just say, well, we're okay at our church. We've got a few Latin families, Latino families, and a few black families or members. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about the ideology that operates in this country, not because we have chosen it individually and say, yeah, that's what I am, but because it's there. And I'm a white person too, and I'm not fully aware of all of the things that I think and do. But I'm really thinking that that is one example into American cultural and American national values. So, I want to give one example, and I'll be quiet for a minute.
All right.
The Sunday after Botham Jean was shot in his apartment, you know who I'm talking about? By a police person. There was not a black Church of Christ or a black Christian body of any sort that did not overtly mourn that death in their worship service on Sunday. I've not heard of any white churches that did. There was a church here in Abilene where a black deacon was saying the closing prayer. It had not been mentioned otherwise, and he just simply made a simple prayer for peace after the tragic death. It's a white congregation here in Abilene. After the service, this black brother told me this. He was attacked verbally, not physically, but verbally attacked in the parking lot for bringing politics into the worship service. When we have bought so much into American national values that you can't even say a Christian conviction without being accused of being involved in partisan politics, and he was not. Something is deeply, deeply wrong. And that, in my opinion, is the chief, I would say the chief, but it is definitely one of the chief issues that churches of Christ, and we're talking mostly about us today right now, have got to deal with. And you can't just continue to say, we don't have a problem with that.
Suzie, what are some, following that same line, what are some other cultural forces that may be paralleling some of this graphs that you saw?
Yeah, so what Doug is pointing to here is something that the sociological literature has been looking at for the last 25 years. There's a great article by Houghton Fisher. It came out in the early 2000s that looked at that rise in the religious nuns, those unaffiliateds that was happening in the 1990s. And this is one of the things they pointed to, was that young people in particular are acutely aware of this hypocrisy and much less willing to set that aside. And they don't want to see hypocrisy in their church. And they feel that this kind of coming together of white Christian evangelicalism in particular and kind of this American ideology, that is problematic for them. And so they have left, and then they have kids, and those kids are not being raised in churches. I think going along with this, you just have this very individual culture. We've moved away from community. I have lots of students who tell me that they can be spiritual and they can be Christians without community, and I just don't think that's possible. That is not what Scripture shows us. That is not the model that Jesus has for us and sets out for us. And so I think that there is a lack of value in community. I oftentimes say, I don't know how people survive without a church community. How do you make friends? Who do you go to for help with things? Who brings you meals after you have a baby or are sick in the hospital? And young people do not, in particular, young people, I'm talking about millennials and Generation Z, just do not value that community in the same way that previous generations do.
And I think, going back to values, I think one of the things that American churches value in an incorrect way is a faulty sense of peace. And by peace, I just mean an absence of conflict. And I think we have a lot of folks, church leaders among us, that will do almost anything to avoid conflict. That means we won't have difficult conversations with each other. We won't talk about prophetic things. We won't have those conversations. And some of the younger generations, especially, just like from the graph, they see that. They recognize that. And in some sense, they're repelled by that. And I know we're trying to move forward in time chronologically, but I think, again, there are some historic roots to that in American Christianity. Denominationalism, and I know that term is problematic in our tradition, but the idea of denominationalism was born really in America. The idea that you can choose which congregation, which group of Christians you are going to associate with. Until that time, and if you just go back to our European heritage, I'll ask students sometime, well, how did you determine whether or not you were going to be a Protestant or a Catholic? Well, it depended on the king or the queen. You know, the king was Protestant, so were you. If the queen was Catholic, so were you. And you really didn't have a choice in the matter. Now, there are some wonderful things that come with freedom. But one of the byproducts of freedom in our world in terms of Christianity is suddenly you had these congregations of Christians, their mission began to change a little bit because now they're competing for adherence. Now, it's a buffet line, and now people can choose. So now if we're leading these congregations, I want to do the very best that I can to attract more people to my church so they won't go to yours. So we build the best programs, we hire the flashiest preacher and the best youth minister and build the best building, and we want to do everything that we can to attract people to our place. And that's ingrained in American religion. That's really who we are. In a very negative way, that's a big part of our identity. So when you have a model like that, what that breeds is you're very hesitant to talk about anything that's controversial. And then when you do, it's a firestorm. Because we've built a culture where, and this is, I think, one of the things we have to deal with, church. We've built a culture that says that if I disagree with you, then I can't worship with you. That's craziness. And that's just pervasive in our congregations. You've experienced it as church leaders. And that needs to change. And I think that's one of the significant things that is contributing to this decline. Because we have people, very well-meaning, deep-thinking, thoughtful Christian people that are saying, we need to have these tough conversations, and we need to do it not afraid that you're going to take off if we disagree.
And some are gravitating to places where the tough conversations are taking place.
That's right.
That's why it's interesting to me, Suzie, that some of the churches, not churches of Christ, you have a broader definition, the ones that are really growing in a good sense of the term are what we would call high accountability churches. High demand, high commitment. We're not interested in having you here if you're just a floater.
Yeah, they're getting rid of the freeloaders, the freeloader phenomenon. And this is one of the things that really insulated evangelical Christians or conservative Christians up until the 1990s, was that requirement that these churches required more of you. There was a bigger commitment to join, and so you'd be less likely to leave. And we still see that in a number of traditions. If you want to look at the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or Jehovah's Witnesses, or Assemblies of God through the 90s, although they're starting to see some leveling off in the United States as well. But these are congregations or denominations that really require a lot of their membership, and so people are much less likely to leave, and the people who are there are more engaged and more involved. They're not just coming on Sunday morning and sitting and then leaving out the back door.
Okay. I just want to say before we got too far away, Doug Foster's the only guy I know that can go from church parking lots to the Civil War in 5 minutes. That's great. That's impressive anyways.
That's a gift.
Well, so kind of pulling back, let's go into the early decades of the 20th century. What are some things that happened there, Doug, that really began to set the stage, begin to shape us? I know that you are really impressed with T.B. Larrymore and some of the messages that he delivered. Talk a little bit about him and how we have that part in our DNA and how we can recapture that part.
Most of you know a little bit, I guess, about the history of the Stone-Campbell Movement, Churches of Christ. So after the Civil War especially, the sectionalization as well as a number of factors, doctrinal factors, began to lead to a separation within the movement, what would eventually become the Christian Church's Disciples and Churches of Christ. And you see, well, let me say it slightly differently. You know, it seems to me that it's always true that your greatest strength becomes your greatest weakness. Your greatest strength is exactly where Satan is going to be attacking you. So we have a deep commitment to scriptural authority. We have a deep commitment to knowing what the Bible says and to following it. That is a good thing. That is a strength. We've got to have that. But that becomes our greatest temptation as well. The temptation is that Satan comes in and says, well, you are smart enough to have all this figured out. You have reached the completion. You've got all the doctrines right. You've figured out everything the Bible says, and therefore you must promote that, and anyone who disagrees with you is obviously not a follower of Christ, not a lover of Christ. And so that attitude begins to come in. And so in the separation between disciples and Churches of Christ, a lot of that attitude is seen. A lot of the divisive attitudes on all sides. We're not saying you are the good guys and you're the bad guys. This attitude is pervasive. And I'm talking now specifically about our history. So when you get into the early 20th century, you begin to see a lot of attitudes that go down to the most minute doctrinal point. Absolute doctrinal precision is what certifies you as a true Christian or not. Now, that was not absolutely new in our history, but it was definitely an attitude that becomes strong in that period of our history. But there were always people who knew better. I mean, you go even back to the earliest days with Alexander Campbell. Alexander Campbell, nobody is stronger on emphasizing doctrinal beliefs and practices, okay? But when he got into an argument with some folks over a very important theological point, he basically backed off and said, okay, I know what the bottom line really is. It is the image of Christ that the Christian looks for in the other, and not adherence to any specific doctrines. He's not saying doctrine's unimportant. He's saying that doctrine is not the end. Doctrine is to transform us into the image of Christ, struggling sometimes with some of these doctrinal ideas. And so Campbell says that, and T.B. Larimore in his day, T.B. Larimore is an evangelist, widely loved. He lives before the divisions. People on all sides love Larimore and know him, and they want him to take a stand on the issues, right? The issues of the day were instrumental music, missionary societies, whether or not you could have a paid preacher. Of course, I'm against that. Not really. But whether or not, a number of things like this. Later on, it would become things like Sunday school classes and whether or not you had more than one cup in the Lord's Supper, etc. But they were pressing Larimore. Brother Larimore, everybody knows you, everybody loves you, everybody respects you. Please take a stand on these issues. Let us know what you think. And he basically said, and he was not, it sounds facetious, but he was really not being facetious. He said, I prefer to sit on the issues and to stand on Christ. He said, there's not been a Sunday when I haven't been preaching and evangelizing and teaching people about Jesus Christ. He held the longest gospel meetings, as we used to call them, in the history of the movement in different places. One of them lasted over 6 months, preached 3 times on Sunday, twice every day during the week. Somebody said, how did you keep preaching? Would you run out of sermons? He said, I'll never run out of sermons. But anyway, his attitude was, I love people, I love Christ, and I love people. And he modeled the image of Christ. He did not have an attitude. I think a lot of times what happens is that we, because of that good impulse to know the truth, to know what Christ wants us to do, and to know the doctrines and so forth, the temptation is to say, okay, we've got this right, and therefore we've got to crush anybody who disagrees with this. And we become hateful and condemnatory. If I thought that that's what Christianity was about, I would say I want nothing to do with Christianity.
One of the interesting things out of some disaffiliation research that I've done with Dr. Sharp-Pena here at ACU, we asked people who no longer attend Churches of Christ, but at one point did. We asked, why did you leave? And the number one response from men and women has to do with this idea of climate and exclusivity and this feeling that you can't have a disagreement. And I think that very much ties into what you're saying.
And one of the tragedies about that is really not the strongest or most historic part of our heritage. In fact, the strongest and most historic part of our heritage is this idea toward unity for the sake of the mission of Christ. I mean, that's really how we began and really get the impulse to who we are. And I know we're not supposed to get into too much of the prescriptive stuff. They're going to get into that later this weekend, but it would seem to me...
Go ahead. They need all the help they can get. Go ahead.
Well, it seemed to me if we were to chart a path forward, that we would need to begin in some ways to reclaim that most significant and most central part of our heritage. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to become dispassionate about the things that you believe. You don't have to set aside everything that you believe. What that means is, though, you don't have to disfellowship someone with whom you disagree. And that's an important principle, I think, that we have to come to grips with.
The other thing, too, you combine that with what church historians might term a free church movement, meaning we're independent congregation. There is no authority beyond the local congregation. There's nothing that stops a family or 2 or 3 or 4, if they hit a disagreement, just moving down the street and starting another congregation. And that, Suzie, probably is a major contributing factor to your average size of Churches of Christ being, 50 or under?